Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this new appointment of the 40 under 40 lecture series on combustion. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce and welcome Dr. Ryan Falkenstein-Smith. He's a mechanical engineering in the firefighting technology group at the Fire Research Division of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the NIST. I think Ryan will talk about what NIST does in general. He got his PhD in mechanical and aerospace engineering from Syracuse University, and he performed research on high temperature membranes for oxy-fuel combustion. He then continued as a NIST postdoctoral fellow, and in this position, he actually created model validation datasets for pool fire characteristics, and this was in support of the International Association of Fire Safety Science Measurement and Computation or Fire Phenomena Working Group. Currently, Dr. Falkenstein-Smith research focuses on designing technologies for smart fire fighting, including gas extractive devices for predicting backdraft and non-invasive analytical tools to improve situational awareness. Today, Dr. Falkenstein-Smith will talk about the key issue of ventilation in fire safety science, and I look forward to hearing this presentation. Thank you again for having accepted our invitation, and I give you the floor. Thanks.
Thank you so much. No, this is a very great opportunity to talk a little bit about the research that we do here at NIST in terms of fire research, and also to highlight a little different things that I've been working on over the past couple of years. So what exactly is NIST? NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and we focus on promoting U.S. innovation and industrial competitiveness by advancing measurement science and standards and technology. So one example that we always give is, the weight of a kilogram, and there's a very fine way to measure a kilogram. And NIST is responsible for maintaining that standard. And we also generate a bunch of other different types of standards like gas sensing technology or gas standards or chemical standards or physical measurements. Mainly NIST is focused on metrology or measurement science, rigorous traceability such that those weights and measures that we have can be passed down so that other scales that are out there within the United States have some traceability back to NIST. And the other thing is development and use of standards and codes. And that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit with the Fire Research Division. So in 1973, there was a report put out by the National Commission of Fire Prevention and Control, which basically investigated the fire problem. And one of the best quotes that is taken from that write-up is, "It's appalling that the richest and most technologically advanced nation in the world leads all the major industrialized countries in per capita deaths and property loss from fire." And this highlighted a fire problem that was going on within the United States. Not to say that fire research wasn't going on, but this report really was the birth of an organized effort towards developing technology and developing science that improves our understanding of fire. And the report generated the U.S. Fire Administration, the National Fire Academy, the National Fire Incident Reporting System, as well as the Fire Research Division in the National Bureau of Standards, what NIST used to be known as. But the biggest thing is, this is the report that organized our division for what it is known today. And our division essentially does a variety of different experiments and simulation at various scales. And what you're seeing here in this slide is different scales. And when I talk about scales, it's an order of magnitude difference for the controlled volume. But you see a very simple slot burner that's 10 centimeters long from a natural gas in an open environment. You have a pool fire, and what you're seeing here is a methanol liquid pool fire of a 30 centimeter diameter circular pool. You have a reduced scale enclosure, in this case a doghouse, in which you're taking temperature measurements and velocity measurements. You have a standard compartment or an ISO room that basically you're doing experiments on a room scale. And then NIST in our division, we also branch out to prescribe wildfires. And actually from this video, you're seeing a technology that we developed here that allows us to get a 360 image of a wildfire in real time as it's happening. And if anybody's interested in any of this, please feel free to my contact information is going to be provided at the end. But we're only going to be talking about a couple different things today. But if you're interested in anything else, please feel free to contact me, because the range of experiments is pretty vast of everything that we do here at NIST in the Fire Research Division. And when you start thinking about scale, well, there's a lot of different challenges with that, because a lot of things that we do here for model development in fire dynamic simulation is really reliant on robust models that can be applied to various different scales. And when I was a postdoc, I started getting involved in something called the Measurement and Computational Fire Phenomenon, or MAC-CFP. And this is a working group whose goal is to establish structural effort in fire research community to make significant and systematic progress in fire modeling by working with experimentalists and computationalists to compare different modeling efforts that are going on throughout the world to see how models are be able to reconstruct simple fire phenomenon from experimental data. And what I was tasked with when I started here at the Fire Research Division was characterizing the spatial distribution of principal chemical species in moderate scale pool fires. So what you're seeing, hopefully, from these images that are keeping up, and these videos that are keeping up, is a 37 centimeter gas burner and that 30 centimeter methanol burner. It's a pool fire. It's very simple. It's very easily defined in terms of diameter. You can also define the amount of liquid by maintaining a certain lip height, and you can get burning rate. But the idea, what I was tasked with, is characterizing within the center line, basically how gas species translate as you move further and further up away from the fuel surface. So if you don't really understand pool fire work, I'm just going to explain it quickly. Essentially, you have a continuous feed. If it's gas, it's very simple using a gas burner. But you have a fuel reservoir if you're using a liquid fuel that's maintaining a certain lip height. And when I say lip height, essentially what I'm talking about is that liquid surface that you have for the fuel and the actual height of the container that's holding that liquid. And the difference between those is that lip height, which can actually have some effects on how something burns. You also have chilled water, so that's feeding into the burner, so that you're maintaining minimal heating effects that are going on within the burner, so that you have this quiescent flame that's burning in a steady state environment. And the back end of it, from some of these gas species measurements, is essentially you have a quenching probe that's thermally quenching the gas species that you're measuring from, and that's feeding into a soot filter and a mixing chamber to make sure the gas is mixed, and it's fed into a gas chromatograph that is equipped with a mass spectrometer. And what that essentially does is that provides you a time average measurement from a local regime. So essentially, from that quenching probe, you're sampling a gas, you're partitioning out the soot that might be generated in that sample that you're extracting, and then it's fed into a GCMS where you're characterizing either small or trace amount species or permanent gas species. And what you're seeing here is the setup that we applied to provide that gas species analysis in various pool fires. So we basically investigated a variety of different pool fires. What you're seeing here is 3 liquid pools and one gaseous pool. Essentially, it's methanol, ethanol, acetone using that 30 centimeter pool fire and the 37 centimeter pool fire for methane. Mass burning flux obviously are a little bit different because you have different fuels and different heats of combustion associated with those fuels, but you have a set diameter for that pool. So heat release rates are also going to be different. Mean flame height is also another way to kind of characterize these flames in an open environment. This is used either using MATLAB code for what we did here, so essentially taking that video, converting it to a binary image, and then basically counting pixels associated with the flame height in real time to get an average height. Other people correlated to Heckerstad's correlation to get an idea of the mean flame height, which does correspond to the burning rate as shown by Heckerstad a couple decades ago. So all we're really doing here is we're looking at the gas species along the center line of the pool fire. And the plot that you're seeing to the right is looking at those species measurements, mainly the parent fuel, oxygen, carbon dioxide, water, carbon monoxide, other emitted species like hydrogen and benzene, and some other trace species like formaldehyde. And what you're essentially tracing is you're basically seeing that the concentrations vary along the center line of the pool fires. You get higher and higher up, you get closer to a mixture fraction of 0. For those of you who don't really know, mixture fraction, we're just defining based on a carbon basis here, which is kind of following Peter's work back in the 80s. So what you're seeing is that close at 0, very close to the in the upper plume, you see basically it's close to mass fraction of air. So very low concentration of fuel, carbon dioxide, water vapor. But as you get to higher mixture fraction, meaning that you're getting closer to the fuel surface, you're seeing that, you see higher concentration of fuel, less concentration of oxygen, and carbon dioxide and hydrogen and water vapor and carbon monoxide are actually increasing as well. The solid lines that you're seeing in this plot are that ideal state relation. And this is a paper that we published back in the Combustion Symposium, the proceedings of the Combustion Symposium back in 21, that basically show that at the center line of the pool fire, for all these different fuels, compared to an ideal state relation, which is those solid lines, we're matching fairly well, in some cases within experimental uncertainty. And that can kind of be important when you're trying to get an estimation or developing models about chemical species within the center line of a pool fire based on mixture fraction. So if I know the mixture fraction and I'm trying to estimate, let's say, carbon dioxide, well, I can say that, hey, it's following this ideal state relation, so I can get approximate the concentration of that carbon dioxide when I have the mixture fraction. But if we think back to this range of fire experiments, it's really vast about developing these models. I mean, the model that I showed for mixture fraction can be applied across multiple states. If you know kind of these different components and are you characterizing something by mixture fraction or Z star or an ideal heat release rate, you can kind of get an idea of how things are growing and developing within a fire. And one thing that we pride ourselves here at NIST is our fire calorimetry database. So the National Fire Research Lab, which was a warehouse, a big warehouse facility that we have at NIST with multiple hoods that incorporate oxygen consumption calorimetry, we're able to actually measure heat release rate and characterize different fires sizes and burning a variety of different fuels. So this is a public website. If anybody's ever interested, I highly suggest that you go to nist.gov/el/FCD. And what you do is essentially you look at a variety of different burns that go on at NIST, a variety of different fuel packages or configurations. And I'll show a demonstration of kind of what this looks like. But the benefit of a lot of stuff that we do is not only do you get a video, which we'll see in a bit, but you also get these other different measurements of heat release rate and yields based on different fuel types that you're burning. So what I mean by yields essentially is, let's say you're burning a wood crib or you're burning a gaseous fuel, you can measure out the total mass of the gaseous fuel or of the mass based on a load cell of how much the fuel was burned. And by the total heat release rate that we're measuring via oxygen consumption calorimetry and estimating for some composite fuels, the heat of combustion, you're actually able to back out the yield of that component or the mass of some species generated relative to the total mass of the fuel that's been burned. And the mass of some species that's generated is how we measure things downstream. So for instance, soot is measured from a laser extinction measurement, and you'll be able to get the soot yield from not this equation, but from that extinction measurement. If you talk about carbon monoxide, if you measure from a well-mixed region very further downstream in a duct from the emissions generated from the fire, you're basically able to get the mass of that species, in this case carbon monoxide, relative to the heat of combustion or the quotient of the total heat release rate and the heat of combustion of the mass that's been burned. So anything that we burn, we're able to get these yields of these components. In other words, if you want to know a toxic species yield of carbon monoxide, well, of let's say a vacuum that's been burned, we have that information that we could provide to the public so that you can get an estimation of the emissions that are generated from that burn. And that's pretty valuable stuff. So what I'm going to show here, I'll do a little bit of setup of this video, is we're going to see some barrier fabric tests that we've been conducting here at NIST. This is a recent test in July. And essentially what this is showing is we're going to see ignition happen at underneath the furniture. You're going to see the fire spread. And all this is being done underneath the hood. And essentially what you're measuring is you're measuring not only the heat release rate, but the yields of these components. In other words, CO production and species generation as the fire is progressing over time. And you can generalize these things based on yields because of all of these different materials that are within this room structure, how essentially things are being generated overall. So let me see if I can play this. And heat release is also being overlaid when you plot this. So there's the ignition underneath that pillow. And what we're going to see slowly is that the flame is going to spread over time. So you can see that the heat release is very low. That fire is spreading over the entire couch. This is typically a furniture that what you would see in somewhat like a living room. Flame is spreading underneath. You see a smoke layer in the upper region. You achieve flashover, and that's kind of what we're seeing here. The entire room is engulfed, and we get a heat release rate of around 6,000 kilowatts. And basically everything's gone. And that happened over a period of about 30 minutes from ignition all the way from the generation. And now you're kind of seeing the residuals just being burned off. You can also see, if we just kind of circle back, we see if I can hit it from that video, how the smoke plume is being generated and how all that emissions going underneath and into the duct. So when I talk about yield, all these measurements are not being sampled directly right here, close to the outlet of the opening of the room. It's being measured very far in the duct in a well-mixed area so that you can get the components, how species concentration are being generated over time, as well as the yield of those components. And this is very powerful stuff because you have all these different configurations, you have all these different fuels that are being burned over time. And because you have this heat release and species generation, not only do you get an idea of how the fire dynamics work, but you get an idea of how things are being emitted into an open atmosphere. And that's one of the things that we're going to be talking about today. Is we'll be talking about ventilation and how ventilation can affect species generation, not only in a room environment, but an open environment. Pool fires, which I talked about previously, have an open environment, and you get an idea of how we're measuring those things. But when you talk about the opening of a room, those things can affect species generation, either yield or how things are developing over time. This can be very important to how we get predictions of toxic species yields that might affect somebody's life down the road. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that experiment that I just showed, looking mainly at tenability and toxicity when we start talking about how we're characterizing these things in an enclosure, or in this case, a room with an open opening, a wide opening. So what we did for those experiments, and you kind of see if we circle back, you see this bar, is we have a multi-sampling probe at 5 feet in height. And that's going to allow us to actually get the tenability within the room. But we had to make species concentration measurements using a gas analyzer, and that's what you're seeing in that black box, Fourier transform infrared sensoring. So that's an FTIR. You have a heated pump so that you're not condensing anything out within the line that you're sampling from. And then we also have some other sorbent tube materials so that we can have some orthogonal measurements. We're not necessarily going to be talking about that today, but at NIST, a lot of things that we report here, we also have to have a complementary measurement to make sure that we're accurately measuring things and everything that we report is appropriately reported. So in other words, for the soda lime tubes, I'm measuring HCN. The FTR is also measuring that. I just want to have an orthogonal measurement such that I can confirm readings that I'm getting the FTR are correct. So just a little bit talking about, if you don't know, a Fourier transform infrared, essentially it's this gas cell that's contained in this box. You're making a laser measurement, and the laser essentially is bouncing back and forth multiple times within that gas sampling cell. Now, this is kind of challenging when we talk about gas sampling and extracting, because if you want something very sensitive, you want a long path length for that laser beam. And well, the sensor that we actually use here, and this is the FTR that we have for our yield measurements, is a 10-meter path length cell, meaning that we're making very, very sensitive measurements, looking at things below, let's say, in some cases, 1 ppm. The challenge with that is that even though you have a long path length, this gas sampling cell can be very large. So to capture things that are happening rapidly, it's going to be very challenging to do that because you have a very big gas cell, and to flush the entire thing out, you need to high flow, which can present its own problems down the road. But if you look at the measurements that we're making within that room relative to different events that happened, like the smoke alarm going on, the flashover occurring, and then water suppression with the fire department going in and suppressing everything, we're actually able to trace out these species fairly well. In other words, the black line that you're seeing is the heat release rate. You have CO generation that remains fairly steady. And this is within the room again.
You also have some NOx measurements that peak towards the flashover. HCN also is shown to peak. These values are multiplied for HCN, multiplied by 10, just so you can see the curve a little bit better. And then you also see some total hydrocarbons. But this is all measured at 5 feet. And the benefit of that is that gives us an idea of tenability, or how appropriate is it in the room for somebody to kind of stay in the room. Obviously, you have flashover and you have a big fire that's occurring, but this gives you an idea of toxicity as opposed to thermal tenability. Thermal tenability in this case would happen way before something that we would have for toxicity tenability. And if you don't really know about toxicity tenability, that's okay, because it's measured by something called a fractional effective dose, or an FED. And from the equation that you're seeing at the bottom right, we took the CO and HCN calculations, and this is an equation provided from an ISO standard to calculate that FED. And when you have an FED of about 1, that is an assumption that 50% of the occupants within the room might be okay. Now, again, this is, if I show you here, it doesn't mean that, at 10 minutes, the thermal exposure is okay too. This doesn't account for any thermal exposure within the room. If you see a fire, typically the best thing to do is evacuate as best you can. But it does give you an idea of how the smoke is going to affect the tenability, or the willingness to stay in the room as best as possible. And it isn't until flashover that you see really that FED of 1 and greater kind of take win, meaning that that smoke is really becoming a big issue within the room. You also see here about the probability of incapacitation. This is a logarithmic assumption. It's known pretty well that at a FED of 1, 50% probability of incapacitation, but it's assumed beyond that. So if you're looking at this, this is not the gospel, in other words, of you actually and get the probability of incapacitation with an FED of 6. This is an assumption. We don't really know very well in terms of fire the probability of incapacitation once we get past an FED of 1. And that's because, you have not only the smoke toxicity, but you have thermal tenability within the room structure. But it is kind of assumed that it fits along this logarithmic fitting. But I talk about yields of these components, and how exactly is that done? So we have a calorimetry room in the back. It essentially is in a whole nother room when we do something at the National Fire Research Lab. And the smoke that's being generated is basically 50 diameters downstream from the duct that we sample from. So we take another sample, and we have the exact same setup that we had within the sampling room. And all we're really doing is we're trying to get an idea of the yields. So the yield essentially is going to be the integration under the curve of all these lines. So we have another FTIR. It has a longer path length cell, so you have better sensitivity. And all you're essentially seeing is you're seeing CO and HCN and NOx. And to get the yield of those components, we're integrating under the curve. We're also measuring using a mass flow controller the total mass that's being generated. These are, again, concentrations, and the product of those things with a little bit of finagling is going to give you the mass generated, or the total mass generated, of these components that we're able to measure with the FTIR. You can also see that heat release rate and these other gas species concentrations very far downstream are somewhat being responsive. So although we have a long path length cell, you can see that these peaks are corresponding fairly well to the heat release rate. HCN is peaking a little bit afterwards. NOx is peaking a little bit afterwards, as well as CO. But you see that response, even though you have a very long residence time than the FTIR, it's matching fairly well to the other things that we're measuring with the heat release rate. So what we're essentially taking, if you integrate under the curves for all those concentration values, is the yield of those components. So this is our National Fire Research Lab measurement. You're seeing the yields of these components, and this is the yield from the FTIR that we have in the room. The CO matches fairly well with an experimental uncertainty. Same thing with CO2. Soot, we're not measuring with an FTIR, so we don't have to worry about it. But the HCN measurement and the NOx measurement can't be measured with NFRL, meaning that we're able to measure with FTIR, but with the standard gas analyzer system that they have, they don't necessarily make those measurements. But today we're only really talking about ventilation. And one of the things that I've been challenging myself with over the past several years is how exactly do yields of toxic species like HCN and carbon monoxide correlate to ventilation across different scales? And this is a question that's been plaguing a lot of combustion scientists and fire researchers over several years. And it kind of traces back to these hood experiments that happened in the 80s and 90s, starting with Byler. And what he had is he had this very fancy hood, and he used a burner, very similar setup to the pool fire setup that we have. And he was able to modify the height of the hood such that the smoke layer relative to the height of the burner could be modified. And meaning that it would also modify the air that's being entrained around the burner because the distance between the smoke layer and the burner was also changing. So essentially, the hood height was changing, which modified the air intake. And similar to what we do in NFRL, he was measuring very, very far downstream of CO production. And this essentially was characterizing, and something that we're all familiar with as combustion scientists, of the equivalence ratio. So you know the fuel that's being put in, you have an idea of the air that's being entrained inside that enclosure, meaning that you know this equivalence ratio, the actual fuel to air ratio relative to the stoichiometric fuel to air ratio. And we're going to dive in a little bit about this equivalence ratio measurement, how it's been applied to fire safety science and these various definitions that people have incorporated across different scales and exactly what they're measuring. Because a lot of people have taken this equivalence ratio or a variation of this definition, and they've tried to correlate it to different species generation, trying to provide a measurement technique or an estimation of how species yields generate and how they correlate to the ventilation of the equivalence ratio within a specific controlled volume. Again, when we say controlled volume in this talk, we're talking about variation of an order of magnitude of the controlled volume in terms of scale. So looking at those hood experiments, Byler found for solid fuels, and he also did gaseous fuels and some liquid pool fires as well, you can see that at equivalence ratio of 0.5, you don't start seeing the CO yield until after that. And under rich conditions, the CO generation kind of increases and then peters off at around an equivalence ratio of 1.5. And these hood experiments laid the groundwork for a lot of other researchers to attempt the same thing. Toner, Morhart, and Zukowski expanded upon Byler's work by basically modifying the hood in various setups. So what you're seeing on the left is you see basically another way that we can introduce air into the upper layer of the compartment. In Byler's work, there was really no accountability of air within that plume. So in other words, the air that was entrained mainly came from the underneath or that was interacting within the fire. It wasn't necessarily air entrained into the upper layer of the compartment. And this is what allowed Toner, Morhart, and Zukowski to establish something called the upper layer equivalence ratio. And what that was is the mass originating from the fuel to all air. So in other words, they're not only accounting for the air that was entrained in the lower region of their controlled volume, but also the air that was in the upper layer. And they did this by adding more air into the upper layer. And basically they were allowed to correlate species yields and characterize those relative to the upper layer equivalence ratio. And these things are still used to this day. In this Society of Fire Protection Engineering handbook, these equivalence ratio definitions are reported. And in some cases, some people still use them for various things. The other thing I will point out is that in the experiments for Byler, he was using a gas analyzer very similar to what we use for our CO yield measurements, using an NDIR sensor. But in these experiments, Zukowski refines the gas species concentration measurements a little bit better using a gas chromatograph. Very similar approach to what I showed and what I've done for our pool fire experiments. So a lot of these hood experiments that was deemed by Bill Pitts, who was at NIST back in the early 90s, he came up with this thing called a global equivalence ratio concept. And we're going to dive into what exactly the global equivalence ratio means and how it characterizes ventilation. So don't panic. But Pitts essentially did a review of all these different hood experiments, and he came up with this concept of this global equivalence ratio. In other words, you have this large enclosure. It's not necessarily contained solid state or steady state tubular furnace, and you're characterizing the ventilation within that enclosure as well as how the fuel is being fed in. And he proposed that CO production can correlate to this global equivalence ratio with certain caveats. These caveats essentially are quenching of a turbulent fire plume when it enters the upper layer. So in other words, some of these species are being quenched and they're going to the upper layer, and that's not necessarily accounted for in CO. Mixing of air into the upper layer, pyrolysis of particulate matter that might occur for some of these solid fuels in a very high temperature oxygen completed environment, and then the addition of CO generation in the upper layer due to kinetic interaction driven by high temperature. And this basically prompted Pitts to do his own experiments using a reduced scale enclosure. And he was able to kind of not solidify, but kind of point out these caveats a little bit more. And it allowed him to develop an algorithm of which he could measure or predict the global equivalence ratio, approximate it within an enclosure, and get an idea of the CO production. And that's essentially what the algorithm was. But Pitts wanted to refine this a little bit more by accounting for the variation in temperature, that last caveat of CO production and the kinetic interaction, and how temperature is driving the production of CO a little bit more. And it prompted him not only to do these reduced scale enclosures, but then to do the solid state tubular furnace with a controlled equivalence ratio and modified temperature. And that essentially prompted this concept of how temperature is interacting with these things. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that plays into effect when using this global equivalence ratio. So to back up a little bit, the global equivalence ratio essentially can be interpreted as, if you have a controlled volume, it's all unburned and combusted fuel and air. So if you have a generation of CO2 that's derived from a parent fuel, the global equivalence ratio is accounting for that. It does somewhat trace back to that traditional equivalence ratio definition, but we're accounting for everything that's been combusted as well. And it's still relative to that stoichiometric fuel to air ratio. Now, in an enclosure or in any environment that's a larger scale, it's easy to kind of get an idea of the mass of fuel that's being generated, because for solid fuels, you have the mass loss rate. For liquid fuels, you have the mass loss rate. You also, for gaseous fuels, can get an idea of the mass fuel flow rate. Air is a little tricky. And Vito Babruskas basically provided an approximation, and what you're seeing this middle equation here, to get an idea of vent opening size and how that corresponds to the mass of air entering into an enclosure. And that can also be simplified by simplifying some of these parameters to this kappa value. And a lot of people interpret this kappa value to be 0.53 to get an idea of the mass of air that's being introduced into an environment. And this kind of gets a little confusing when we start talking about sampling from local regimes. So if you're not sampling downstream, you're going to sample mainly from a local environment within your entire controlled volume. In other words, I can't get, if I am sampling from a whole room, I can't get all of this gas shoved into my analyzer to get an idea of the global equivalence ratio. But I can make a local measurement. And this is where things get a little confusing when people report the global equivalence ratio. In Pitts' work and his global equivalence ratio concept write-up, he refers to the global equivalence ratio as a local measurement. And the reason why is because he's using something called a phi meter, which we're going to dive into in a little bit. But if you sample from a local regime, the global equivalence ratio can be interpreted as, from that parent fuel or the V dot fuel that you're introducing, the A, relative to all the air that's been combusted or uncombusted with that value. And you measure that from that component, you're measuring the global equivalence ratio from that environment by looking at not only the amount of moles of that fuel and the amount of moles of air introduced, but also the amount of air that's been unburned. The local fuel equivalence ratio, which is more in line with our traditional equivalence ratio, essentially is the amount of air, in other words, if I sample from this environment, the amount of air that's been unburned, the amount of fuel that's been unburned, and that ratio between those two components normalized by that stoichiometric condition. Now, we'll have questions at the end. If anybody's confused by this or has any more questions about this or wants to debate about this, I'd be more than happy to answer. But the way that you kind of measure these things is using a phi meter. And this is a device that was also developed here at NIST in the early 90s. And essentially what it does is it allows us to make a measurement from a local regime and calculate the global equivalence ratio. In other words, make this estimation of this value here, this global equivalence ratio at the bottom right of the page from a local environment. And this is what Pitts was doing in a well-mixed position within the enclosure, what he interpreted as a well-mixed position, and corresponding that to CO. And the way it works is you have sample inflow is introduced into some high temperature reactor. Maybe you have a platinum catalyst to assist in combustion. And you also have extra oxygen that's allowing a lean combustion occurring inside this reactor. And everything is combusted. And then once everything's combusted, you have carbon dioxide trapped out, you have water vapor trapped out, and you're making an oxygen measurement downstream. And because you have this approximation of air, and you know the amount of oxygen that it was required to combust everything from your sample, whatever you're sampling from, and you make this oxygen analyzer measurement downstream, you get an idea of how much of the parent fuel was combusted relative to where you were sampling from. And I know this concept's a little abstract, but the idea more or less is you're getting an idea, as long as you're sampling from a well-mixed position, how much of the fuel was combusted relative to how much air was entrained into the compartment. And people have applied this technology to large-scale experiments to get an idea of the equivalence ratio. So you see this phi value here, but essentially what we're seeing is this is the global equivalence ratio measurement made using a phi meter. And this was used in a large-scale experiments by Lonermer, Blomqvist, and Manson to conduct a series of room experiments looking at species generation in very underventilated conditions. And you're seeing something similar to what we saw for Byler, that, at equivalence ratio greater than 1, you're seeing that the CO generation kind of increases. They didn't go past 1.5 as it peters out, what we saw for Byler, but that 0.5 value for PA66 and PP, polypropylene, essentially is still the CO generation starting at around an equivalence ratio of 0.5, which Byler saw for some of his initial hood experiments. So inspired by Pitts's refinement of his algorithm in accounting for temperature, Goddick and Latimer developed a methodology that uses the equivalence ratio and accounts for their temperature threshold. And essentially what they found is CO generation at ratios or at temperatures greater than 900, really the production is going to level off. So they had a series of large-scale experiments in which they had a fire location and air was introduced into the lower region of the compartment below the fuel source. And they were making these measurements in an exhaust duct downstream. So you had this fire room, you had this smoke that was introduced into the corridor, and then the corridor very far downstream was well mixing that fire plume, and then it was measured inside a duct, and that's how they were getting these CO measurements. And essentially, they were able to characterize that temperature between 800K results in an unreactive gas mixture of CO and CO2. In other words, it's frozen out. And at temperatures above 1100K, they enabled a faster reaction rate of CO production and causing a higher CO production. And this temperature threshold of 800, 900 allowed them to develop this correlation, which is in the SFPE handbook, or the Society of Fire Protection Engineering handbook, that matches fairly well to the Toner, Morhart, and Byler experiments. And that's what you're seeing here is that, those data that we saw before, Goddick and Latimer's fits fairly well. It's not until we get to very severe conditions that that correlation doesn't necessarily hold up. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Other things that people have done on a smaller scale have implemented something called a Purser furnace. So essentially what this is it's a steady state tubular furnace in which you have a sample introduced into the furnace itself. You then have an enclosure, and from that enclosure, you're making an oxygen and CO2 concentration measurement. But the idea behind this furnace is that, similar to what Pitts was doing, is the amount of air that you're feeding in because you're feeding it and you're controlling it in there. You can control the temperature of the environment. And from there, you're measuring the CO and oxygen and all these different yields of the component, not only to characterize the equivalence ratio, but also to characterize how, let's say, CO yield corresponds to that. And this is what Purser has done in the past a very famous fire researcher who focused on toxicity for most of his career and started a lot of toxicity fire research prior to anybody else in the late 70s. And you are seeing the equivalence ratio relative to CO yield. Again, we're following a variety of different fuels, mainly solid state fuels and very cellulosic fuels. And you're seeing a very similar relationship, but a big difference between CO yield at various equivalence ratios. And the one thing that I've been showing you with all these plots is how fittings and how CO production has all fallen onto this one line, regardless of the fuel composition. And Torsen, who worked for FM Global out of Rhode Island, basically developed something called the Torsen apparatus, or a flame or fire propagation apparatus, and that's what you're seeing here on the right, to control the equivalence ratio surrounding the environment, in which he was going to develop a yield, in this case, this is what you're seeing in the table, of CO production that was fuel dependent. So all the other plots that I've shown you in this presentation past have kind of shown a correlation of different fuels and how they're all the same. But Torsen made the argument that it's fuel dependent. And what he's showing you here is based on ventilation that he controlled, he was able to basically show some correlation to predict when a species yield under ventilation controlled environments corresponded to well ventilated. And that's what you're seeing with VC and well ventilated conditions. So in other words, if I wanted to get an idea under a ventilation controlled environment and I had the equivalence ratio, I would take that equivalence ratio, input it into this, know what my fuel is, take those parameters, incorporate that into the correlation. And then I would also have to take the well ventilation of the yield of that component to also get an idea of what the yield would be under a ventilation controlled environment. So all these different species yields relative to the equivalence ratio or ventilation or CO yield is here's a comparison that we're showing here for all these different components. So for Blomqvist and Lautermark, for Goddick and Latimer, that's what you see in G&L, for Byler's work, for Purser's work. And what you're seeing is under very rich conditions, you're seeing essentially that, you know, the equivalence ratio is increasing fairly well with those fittings. And for CO production, you know, under ventilated conditions, meaning equivalence ratio less than 1, they fit fairly well. But it's not until we get to a greater than a value of 1.5 for the equivalence ratio that we start mismatching a lot of these values. And that kind of becomes an issue when you start talking about predicting CO under vitiated environments or oxygen depleted environments. The other thing I'm going to point out here too is that these comparisons are only for solid state cellulosic materials. They're not necessarily for gaseous fuels or liquid fuels, meaning that there's limitations when you start talking about these comparisons. The other thing I'm going to point out too is that other people have adopted mixture fraction as a way to kind of predict species yield. I showed the mixture fraction plot and how you can essentially correlate that to mixture fraction and get an idea of the species generated from there. And Quinteri, another very famous fire researcher, derived a relationship between the equivalence ratio and mixture fraction, that Z value, during different times within a controlled volume. At steady state, you just have this nice relationship is what you're seeing here at the bottom. And other people have been tried to do the same thing by looking at mixture fraction and species generation from those components. And this is what you're seeing, another experiment that we've done at NIST in a reduced scale enclosure, looking at how not only does the species correlate to the ideal state relation, but how the local equivalence ratio is predicting, not really well at all in this case, the CO generation or the CO yield. So one thing I also will talk about, and I know we're kind of running low on time, but at NIST, in the work that I've done over the past couple of years, is development of a second generation phi meter. And the benefit of this device is that you have a high temperature mass flow controller, which essentially we use not only to make that global equivalence ratio measurement, but also the local fuel equivalence ratio measurement. So in other words, not only are we making this ratio of unburned and or uncombusted and combusted relative to stoichiometric value using the traditional phi meter, but we're actually able to make that measurement of uncombusted fuel to air ratio normalized to a stoichiometric ratio of those two components. The benefit of this second generation phi meter is that we can make that local fuel equivalence ratio measurement regardless of knowing what the actual fuel composition is. And I can go in a little bit more detail when there's time for questions, but we've applied this technology in a series of backdraft experiments. And if you don't really know about backdraft experiments, essentially you have a reduced scale enclosure and you're doing it in an environment in which it's vitiated. In terms of oxygen completed, there's a high composition of fuel, high temperature, limited oxygen. And what you're seeing here in the reduced scale enclosure is temperature measurements that have been made, gas positioning samplings near the burner surface, modifying the opening of the door, and then also kind of a spark igniter that generates a spark. And the way these experiments have gone recently is we basically have a closed environment. You have the flame that's going on the inside. This door shuts. And then what happens is we've observed the flame to go out. More fuel is being pumped into that enclosure. And then once the door opens, air is going to rush in and you're going to spark. And we applied the phi meter in these experiments to essentially characterize the ventilation within the enclosure during backdraft and then also during the event itself. So we incorporated our phi meter as well as some gas analyzers and grab samples to get an idea of the ventilation in different positions within the enclosure that we could characterize backdraft with fairly well. Now, I know some of us might say that backdraft is misspelled, but in the States, this is how we do backdraft. Again, if we want to debate it, we can save that for question, but I just wanted to point that out. Making that phi meter real-time local equivalence ratio measurement, we did a variety of different fires. What you're seeing here is our methane fire sizes and propane for that gaseous fuel burner. And over time, after the door is closed, that local equivalence ratio at various positions, so A all the way to F, is kind of all the way at the top, all the way to the bottom. And you're seeing that for methane cases, there's a more richer environment in the upper layer as opposed to the lower layer. And this is, again, in an isolated environment in which limited oxygen is getting in. And that perfectly makes sense. Propane, you see kind of this more homogeneous distribution of fuel within the compartment because basically propane is settling closer to the fuel surface. But we're able to make these measurements using our phi meter. The global equivalence ratio measurement, or the compartment equivalence ratio, is going to be a little bit lower because you have more accountability in terms of the uncombusted components like CO2 and water vapor that are also accounted for in our global equivalence ratio, compartment equivalence ratio measurement. So because you're able to make these equivalence ratio measurements, you get an idea how the fuel is dispersed. And when these backdraft events actually occur, we're able to get an idea of how the flame is going to be generated. So I talked about how the richer region for the methane flames, whereas propane, it's more evenly distributed. And when you see ignition occur within backdraft, you can see that it mainly occurs in the upper region of the methane fires, whereas the propane fires, you see flame propagation happen not only in the up, but downstream. And then the other thing is you see more of a horizontal projection of propane as opposed to methane. So the other reason why we incorporate a gas chromatograph, just because we're NIST, is because we want to verify that our phi meter is making an appropriate measurement. I talk about how we're making this local fuel measurement, and it's agnostic to the fuel composition. And the reason why is because we're kind of making some oxygen consumption across that reactor, but that makes people very hesitant. But what you're seeing here is using a GC, we're actually matching those values very, very well for our local fuel equivalence ratio. The same thing for our global equivalence ratio measurements. Using a GC, which breaks down each individual component, we're actually able to measure the global equivalence ratio measured with our phi meter from a time average measurement used from the GC. The other thing that's beneficial about having a phi meter and having these components and characterizing the equivalence ratio is during the event, we're actually able to characterize prior to ignition the equivalence ratio surrounding the spark igniter. And what you're seeing here is anything with a total heat release rate of 0 has an equivalence ratio less than 1. And greater than that, you see the total heat release rate is increasing, meaning that the stoichiometric conditions are greater than 1. You have a fuel-rich condition. And making some assumptions, because we actually know about the fuel, we can plot the phi meter measurements using some assumptions about the concentrations on a flammability diagram. And in cases that are highlighted in red, that's where cases where ignition was occurred. And the pathway to get all the way to air essentially is going to go through a flammable region, where in cases where no ignition was observed, it didn't necessarily go through that. So one things that we're working on now, especially with our smart firefighting capabilities and the project that I'm in charge of leading, is incorporating these measurements that characterize ventilation and temperature and seeing if we can predict, in this case, backdraft. So there's a patent application that's currently being submitted that basically incorporates all the measurements that we made in the backdraft experiments and puts them to this black box, this algorithm that spits out a logistic regression model that tells you whether or not backdraft is going to occur. Or excuse me, it tells you essentially the likelihood of backdraft. So in other words, if you have firefighters that approach a fire scene, and right now they might have some intuition, but no metric for actually quantifying the likelihood of backdraft, they might approach the scene and slowly do some risk mitigation tactics. What this application would do is it would provide us more situational awareness when somebody is approaching a fire scene. And this is going back to using those ventilation parameters that we had that are basically introduced into a machine learning algorithm. So as I kind of highlighted in this talk, ventilation is a critical parameter for understanding the dynamics in any scenario for fire. We're characterizing ventilation in a variety of different ways using FTIR or fee meters or GCMSs. But the big things is there's different experimental campaigns that were used to have toxic species yield predictions. At different scales, it didn't necessarily show. We show that comparison in which, at purser furnaces relative to large scale experiments that were done by Blomkist and Lumpker, that doesn't necessarily translate very well, especially when you get to rich environments where there's a lot of unburned fuel. And a lot of people have had reservations about a unified gas species prediction theory because it becomes very challenging to capture the flame dynamics that are going on within that enclosure. And, I think understanding the role of ventilation plays in development of the species generation is very illuminating to different pathways that we can start exploring. We talked a little bit about machine learning algorithms that could be put in place. And I really think that that might be something to further explore, given that all the data that we have. So if anybody's interested in learning more about what I just went over, there's reviews about the equivalence ratio definition that I recently published. The backdraft measurements are also recently published in Fire Safety Journal, as well as our second generation fee meter and pool fire work, as well as the patent information there. The other thing I'm going to point out is that if anybody here, I'm not sure if anybody's ever looking for a postdoc position, but NIST is always looking for young, bright, talented minds to join our team to help us work on some of these problems. So if anybody's interested, here's my contact information, and I really encourage you to reach out so that we can have more of a discussion. But I really appreciate everybody's time. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. This was a very inspiring talk. I learned many things. So thank you for that. I will open now the talk for questions. I don't know if there is any question from the audience. I see Salvatore has a question, so maybe I give him the word directly, and then in the meantime, the others can warm up.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ryan, for this interesting talk. Also, I learned some stuff myself, as Professor Parente said. I have a question regarding, you showed uncertainty, you do a quantification of uncertainty. I was wondering all your measurements that you have presented, and I was wondering, how did you quantify uncertainty? Like, I'm guessing that you don't have, you cannot leverage repeatability of experiments, especially large scale experiments. So I was wondering, where did those error bars come from? How do you quantify?
That's a fantastic question. I think a lot of times, especially all scientists, we suffer from really reporting uncertainty values in our measurements, which I am very hesitant about. Here at NIST, it's actually required. Anything that we put out has to have uncertainty bars with it. And the way we characterize that, like if I'm talking about, let's say, the fee meter components, there's error and resolution associated with every single device within this design. And when you take a measurement, you're essentially accounting for the uncertainty or the accuracy within every single component of that device. And then you have a propagation of error because it's incorporating all these different devices into one. So for temperature, let's say something very simple, there's accuracy issues that are associated with that. There's like for a K-type thermocouple, it's like what, 2% or something. And then there's relative to other things. But if temperature is incorporated into, let's say, predicting moles, the total moles within a controlled volume, well, you not only have a temperature measurement, but you also have a pressure measurement as well. So PV equals nRT, you have this equation, you incorporate those uncertainties into equation to via quadrature. And essentially what that does is that provides an uncertainty of the measurement. Now, when we talk about gas chromatograph measurements, like what I'm reporting here, those are time averaged. So you mentioned about sampling from a large scale enclosure. Well, you're sampling for a certain portion of time. You have a certain portion of gas. Let's say it's over 10 seconds. Phi meter, in this case, is taking real-time measurements. So I will average the measurements that I made. I will have uncertainties associated with that average. But then I also have a standard deviation associated with the average that I have just averaged. So real time, you have a standard deviation associated with the measurement that you made within some time window. For GC, because it's time averaged already, essentially the uncertainty is attributed to the uncertainty of the gas species measurement. So in the pool fire paper that I wrote here, there is a 10-page write-up of the uncertainty analysis of GC measurements. So there's uncertainty associated with the injection method. There's uncertainty associated with the calibration standard. And all of that is propagated when you report the uncertainty of some concentration that you're reporting. And again, you know, NIST, we do these technical notes that are open to the public. They're not necessarily journal papers. They're more in depth. We dump a lot of data and we pride ourselves on that because of questions just like that. You want to know how to do it. I'm explaining it to a certain extent, but the math is actually there for you to walk through it yourself. And the same thing with the Phi meter. It's a real-time measurement, but I show you step by step how to do that appropriately. So if I didn't answer your question appropriately, I highly encourage you to really look at these different tech notes and different publications here, because that's going to go into depth. But the answer really is you're accounting for the uncertainty and all the measurement techniques that you're making.
Thank you. And I guess it's very important to have a proper instrument model, as I sometimes heard about, scientists talking about. You have to have also a model of your instrument. I guess for the Phi meter, you really set up a model with its own parameters and uncertainties, and so you propagate them to get the final measurement uncertainty, measurement uncertainty. Yep. Okay, yeah, thank you. Thanks.
No problem.
Thank you. I don't know if there is another question. I see Tarek in the screen. Hi, how are you?
Hi everyone. Hi,
Tarek.
Ryan. Very good talk. Good, thanks. I have a question for you, Ryan.
Yes.
You know, I'm a modeler, and I have a question with respect to modeling. So essentially, when you talk about soot yields or CO yields, basically, it's essentially in the overfire region, right? So when you measure the CO yield, it's essentially in the overfire region. And when I plug that in the modeling, I can have some good estimates of soot or CO concentrations in the overfire. But within the flame itself, the calculation is very poor. So do you have comments about that and thoughts about this?
No, that's a fantastic question. So as a modeler, you're very familiar, I'm assuming, with FDS. Actually, I know you are, because I know you very well. But the idea, more or less, that when I started at NIST, I was working for Kevin McGrattan, Kevin McGrattan's one of the developers of FDS. And there was a conversation that we kept having over and over again about what do you actually input for soot yield for a variety of different scenarios. And he gets that question quite a bit. There was work done in the early 90s, I believe, by Jerry Faith's team. And these measurements of yield components relative to fuels mainly stems in the overfire region. So Jerry Faith and Torsen also made some measurements in the overfire region, and basically looking at CO to soot ratios in the overfire region to get a steady value. within the fire, there's been work that I've done more recently that shows that that ratio doesn't hold within the flame envelope at all. And even in the overfire region, uh, if you're not at an adequate distance away from the fuel surface, you're going to have, at least on the experimental side, various measurements. So there was a paper, I didn't present it here just in the interest of time, but there's a paper that we wrote about different propane fires at different scales. This actually, I think, was published back in January. But you can show that the CO and soot ratio, it looks almost like a curvature. And that's because and this is for propane pool fire in a 37 centimeter burner, but you basically have the amount of oxygen that's entrained to the enclosure and to the flame envelope. And then you also have this temperature effect of what's basically being generated faster. So making an approximation of CO generation and soot generation within the flame envelope using overfire region values is not appropriate, in my opinion. But it is an estimation when you look at a global estimation, especially when you're talking about yields of those ratios, that might be a more appropriate use. But for modelers, this is an existing problem. I've made the joke that if you can get an idea of this unified, and this is where a lot of the work that I've done is stem from, you get this unified idea of, the soot versus CO ratio, and you can really characterize that very well. That's like the holy grail of fire. And I think that'd be very informative to models. But again, this provides an interesting pathway that I think we still need to be exploring. And Anthony Hammonds and I have been doing a lot of that work here at NIST. And I know, Tarek, you and I are involved in the Max CFP. And that work, I think, is still up for debate a lot of times. But that's a very good question. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there other questions? I had one curiosity myself. So, these problems of fire spreading and are especially in open environments are so large in scale that this makes it very difficult to actually to model them, and in particular to find, I would say, a representative configuration that would be relevant to conditions that are met in different cases. So my question would be, does it exist an approach to define relevant, or do you see a way forward in defining these relevant conditions for modeling approaches? And you actually mentioned this, but how do you see the role of AI and machine learning in actually helping in this direction of defining or improving or making simulations more accessible?
No, that's a fantastic question. It doesn't necessarily trace back to scale, but let's say when we're modeling some of these outdoor environments, and we're talking about a kilometer by a kilometer scale, right? For an area of interest, I think I'm not a modeler, I will say that. So if I say anything wrong, Tarek, just shoot me down. But I think the one thing that we need to think about is how much of the physics do we need to capture that is contributing to the overall question that we're trying to answer? So, we get thermal properties of grass, and we get thermal properties of leaves, and these different components that we see. Is that this is just a question? There's not necessarily an answer, but is that necessary to incorporate into the model as well? Because if it is, well, then a computational resources needed to compute a lot of this stuff is going to be tremendous. And, highlighting what exactly are the parameters of interest that are really contributing to flame spread, fire spread, driving, wind-driven flows. When I was a postdoc here, I started doing some work in terms of a generalized number for drag coefficients through vegetation canopy. So, having general approximations like that, I think, can be beneficial. And, they're answering questions that we need answered. But, identifying what is significant that contributes to that answer that we really need and what we don't, maybe that's an answer for AI. Maybe there's a way to kind of identify those key parameters that are really needed to make those predictions. The one caveat I will say with AI is, although it's an intelligent approach, it's only as intelligent as the data that you feed it. And it's only within the bounds of the data that you feed it. So, predictions beyond what we already have, there's a little issues there. And a lot of times in a lot of presentations that I've seen in the past with AI, people use it, I don't want to say abusively, but people use it in a way that I think they're drawing some conclusions that they need more reservations about. But, if this combination of triaging parameters, especially for larger scale stuff, if there's an avenue there, maybe there's something there that we need to look at. And if you can identify some key things that are really driving these phenomena that happen, that would kind of reduce your computational time and really focus us a little bit more on what exactly are the parameters that we really need to highlight in our models. So short answer, there's not an answer. Long answer, it's complicated.
Thank you. I think I agree on the online. I think it's this awareness of the parameters is important. Maybe this is where, yes, it can help. I agree with you totally. I don't know if there is any other comment or question. Otherwise, I would like to really thank you again, Ryan, for this very nice talk. And I like to thank everyone for attending. This recording will be online in a week or so. So if you want to share it with people that might be interested, you're welcome to do it. Thank you again, Ryan. Bye.
Thank you so much for having me.
Bye-bye, everyone. See you next time.
Take care.
Have a nice weekend.
Bye-bye.